Thank you all so much to everyone, to Adi, for all of the organizers. It's been such an absolute pleasure to listen to the presentations and to learn. I feel like in so many ways, the paper has already been expressed more eloquently by others, so forgive me. My concept is relationlessness, which is a mouthful because it's partially incommensurable in its translation from Japanese. And I'll be a bit promiscuous with it and hopefully not obliterated. So, relationlessness. In 2016, I attended a meeting of the local welfare council in a medium-sized city in the Tohoku region of Japan. Just 5 years earlier, the city had been devastated by a tsunami. The terrifying wave took approximately 20,000 lives when it first struck. It displaced nearly 500,000 people, and it continued to take a toll on life far after its waters had receded. People who had lost their homes and were living in temporary housing complexes were at a higher risk for suicide, loneliness, and depression than the general population. The local welfare council was responsible for keeping them alive and socially engaged. Unfortunately, it was not always possible to live up to that responsibility. On the day of the meeting I was attending, everyone was reminded of their limited ability to facilitate or maintain life, or to make people live. A corpse had been found in one of the temporary housing units. No one knew the cause or time of death. However, the smell and state of the body suggested that the person had been left alone in death for more than a week. This, we were told, was a quintessential lonely death, kodokushi, a case of someone who, despite living among other people, died alone, only to be discovered as a rotting corpse. However shocking, this particular lonely death was neither unique nor exceptional. Approximately 30,000 people die as lonely deaths in Japan each year, 30,000. Ironically, the loneliness of these deaths attracts much attention. Indeed, one of the reasons for the meeting I was attending was to tell people involved with the community to avoid speaking to the press, members of which, hungry for a story, were circling outside. Indeed, similar stories abound. They're emblematic of the aging and shrinking of the Japanese population. In those stories, published by reporters and scholars alike, statistics on lonely death are often combined with statistics on suicide. Those numbers, in turn, are cited next to percentages of people who are over the age of 65, of people who live alone, of unmarried people, of people who have never been on dates, of people who do not have children, and of towns and villages classified as depopulated because they no longer have enough people to function. Such stories and statistics aggregate death and non-births to craft a profoundly isolating notion of social life vis-a-vis its failure and its absence. In Japan, this absence and failure goes by the name of relationlessness, muensei. When attributed to a form or organization of activity, the quality of relationlessness coagulates into what is popularly called Japan's relationless society, muen shakai, a collection of people who do not feel meaningfully bound to each other. Here, I will expound upon the relationlessness that can pervade and partially constitute a society. I will consider its usefulness or not as a political concept in relation to three overlapping lines of analysis: relationlessness as a critique of the failures of capitalism, relationlessness as a quality of relations, and relationlessness as revealing the limits of relations or relationality as a critical concept. The phrase relationless society was popularized in 2010 by Japan's national broadcasting company, NHK. It was a play on a word with a long Buddhist history that means disconnected or unrelated spirits, muen botoke, spirits for whom no one makes offerings and who thus have a more difficult time after death. That is, spirits who were left not only alone, but lonely and hungry, emaciated ghosts who could haunt the living. There is some overlap between this image and contemporary relationlessness. Yet while lonely deaths could be thought of as the ultimate sign of atomization or individualization, and the figure of the corpse certainly draws attention, the neologism relationless society also suggested something different. It shifted focus from an unfortunate spirit to an estranged collective. In a series of 3 special broadcasts, viewers were exposed to lonely deaths as a prevalent and growing feature of this world. In a relationless society, then, relationlessness was no longer a condition of the dead or of an individual. Rather, it was to be found around a corpse that had been abandoned before death. In that sense, relationlessness became a property of a world severed from an afterlife. It was something to be found among the living who were insufficiently connected to the not yet dead. That is, one lives in a relationless society as a soon-to-be corpse who has already been abandoned or has already abandoned others. Relationlessness turns death into a marker of discontinuity, aging into a movement toward death, and life into a potential failure to enmesh oneself in webs of relationality. This spectacular rendering of what Pavanelli calls cruddy suffering proved quite popular. 1.5 years after the release of the last television broadcast, NHK published a book with the same name and roughly the same content as the TV shows. That book was followed by many popular and scholarly books, commentary in newspapers, and even political speeches. The phrase relationless society has become idiomatic. It has come up in passionate conversations I've had in Japan with people ranging from monks and priests to doctors and IT engineers. In nearly all those conversations, which closely mirror the text that spread the phrase, my interlocutors focused on relations rather than things. They spoke of a breakdown of certain types of relations, and that breakdown was presented as a problem. More specifically, commentators lamented the weakening or absence of the kin, ketsueng, local, chieng, and corporate, shaeng, relations that had previously sustained Japanese society. Presented in those terms, the relationlessness made present around the rotting corpses of lonely deaths appeared to people as the culmination of Japan's economic and political decline. People spoke of the breaking of social bonds as an effect of the bursting of the economic bubble in 1992. They spoke of hopelessness in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis of 1997. And they spoke of an ongoing crisis of economic failure, lost decades of people who could not find steady jobs, as both cause and effect of the shrinking of the population. The pervasiveness of relationlessness has people raising critiques of the social system they live in. This happens in some surprising ways. For example, even the national government has gotten close to framing the problems of the relationless society as a failure of the heteronormative reproduction of labor power. The current administration, led by Prime Minister Kishida Fumio, has named the creation of a new capitalism, Atarashi Shihon Shugi, as its first priority. This supposedly new capitalism is replete with so-called structural changes, social structural changes. Primary among those is investing in people, hitohe no toshi, with the goal of raising wages and household budgets, which is meant to combat the dwindling population by providing people with the means to, and I quote, choose to marry and have children as they wish. The Kishida administration's new capitalism, in scare quotes of course, builds on former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's women's empowerment policy. Empowerment, in the eyes of the national government, did not and does not mean equality in terms of political power or the ability to choose one's life course. Rather, it means the extraction of so-called productive labor from women, a category of people presented in policy documents as Japan's greatest underutilized potential resource. The policies proposed to further exploit/empower women clearly expose the failures of the gender division of labor in contemporary Japan. They include everything from a revolution in work that would make it easier to take time off and to have and raise children, to government funding for all stages of a child's development. And these are all quotes from government documents. Men would be able to take more paid pregnancy leave, and there's a push for more balanced child rearing. Preschool and kindergarten would become more readily available and heavily subsidized, and parents would get payments, and do get payments already, to help with food, clothing, and housing costs. There is something sort of critical in these policies as a response to relationlessness, just as there is much that is critical in scholarship and popular discourse on the matter. Both bring attention to the failures of capitalism. They do this largely in terms of the distribution of relations, production, and reproduction. That distribution is tied to income and support for life. This is critical insofar as it points to dissatisfaction, loneliness, and inequality and inequity in the distribution of relations. Relationlessness surges as gaps between the production of value and the reproduction of the life that creates that value grow. It also seems to surge as the commensuration of people in their capacity to work does not generate equalities, but rather hierarchies and exclusions based on gender and nationality, for example. The conflict between the human as a being capable of free labor and the Japanese or white person, usually called an American in Japan, as someone entitled to perform that labor, has compelled many commentators, including some politicians, to point out how nationalism has fed into relationlessness. Opening Japan's borders would solve some of the problems associated with the relationless society, such as having enough people to care for the elderly, or, at least, having enough workers to tax to provide Social Security payments to the elderly. Instead of letting people in, and instead of questioning gender and nation as constructs, however, the focus turns to a supposed lack of relations, a lack most poignantly crystallized around the dead, unproductive body. There is little doubt that lonely deaths represent a failure. However, critiquing only the failure of capitalism or any system renders this version of relationlessness largely anti-political. In focusing on failures, such as the failure to reproduce labor power, people lose sight of how those failures are an effect of the so-called successes of the same social system. Similarly, by looking at the distribution of relations, this discourse does not question how that distribution arises in the production of relations itself. In popular discourse, then, relationlessness simultaneously reveals and obscures the conditions out of which it arises and of which it is a part. Relationlessness, while critical of abandonment and a lack of community, threatens people to reproduce or to die alone. It does not question the framework that makes something appear as a relation or lack thereof in the first place. In that sense, to speak of relationlessness is to accept the notions of failure and relation. It is to accept the standards by which something is considered a success and by which a relation is considered relevant and meaningful. Thus, it becomes easy to present the very kin, local, and corporate relations that are described as absent as the solution to the condition of relationlessness. This is where history comes into play in two senses. First, those relations that have supposedly been lost are posited as a prior state that no longer exists. They are presented as a past, the absence of which forms the present. In some ways, then, the types of relations projected into the past are a product of the present. Their purported absence, in turn, makes them a project of the present, an attempt to use a projected past to project a future, to echo Jason a little bit. But here, another history interjects. For if the kin, local, and corporate relations that are now lacking did previously exist, and evidence suggests that, sure, why not? They did for some, right? And if society is now relationless, then those relations themselves must play a role, or must have played a role, in their own negation. This moves us closer to a critical concept that would analytically unify the so-called problem of absence with the proposed solution of presence. This version of relationlessness would avoid presenting a presence as a solution to an absence. In terms of relations, it is clear that, I think, for something to exist as anything other than a potential or an ultimate unity of some sort, it must exist in relation to something else. This is true of absences just as much as for presences. If an absence of relations exists, then it must exist in relations. Interestingly, this brings us to Rahel Yegi's definition of alienation, in which the sense of disconnect between people is a relation of relationlessness. What this means for an analysis is that rather than focus on relationlessness as a simple failure or lack, we must look at it as a quality of relations. In some ways, relationlessness as a quality of relations is exemplified by the meeting about lonely death with which I started this talk. The people who were involved in the meeting were related to each other, to the deceased person, and to the corpse in ways ranging from contractual obligations to friendship. However, the meeting was not about the corpse, let alone the dead person. Rather, the meeting was about preventing the story of the lonely death from spreading in a way that could hurt the local community and the corporate bonds formed in the local welfare council, which was a government contractor meant to provide services that would render kin and local community unnecessary for the maintenance of life. In the example of the meeting, concerns for local and corporate relations drew attention away from mourning, celebration, or other possible engagements with the deceased. Pointedly, the people at the meeting were aiming to prevent the spread of the memory of the person who had passed. The meeting left people with a sense of despair, an anxious helplessness that arose from and required vigilance against publicity. In various ways, then, the meeting itself performed the relationlessness that the people in the meeting were tasked with preventing. The meeting is just one small example of how relations, or more precisely, relations of relations, produce relationlessness. Put differently, it's an example of how relationlessness becomes a quality of the existing relations out of which it emerges. The meeting of the local welfare council demonstrates that kin, local, and corporate relations do not necessarily support each other in a clear hierarchical way that culminates in society. On the contrary, kin, local community, and corporate relations pull at each other, as we all know. They generate contradictory demands and stress in people and in the system of relations itself, a stress that tends to call forth an imperative to achieve a balance that in practice tends to be unachievable. Note that the conflicts between different relations that produce relationlessness do not necessarily arise in failure. Those conflicts seem to arise in what is popularly presented as successful, tight, or strong relations. For example, in Japan, death by overwork, karoshi, has long been a concern for successful salarymen, who are at a greater risk of conditions ranging from heart failure and stroke to depression and suicide than the rest of the population. Even in less extreme cases, a successful salaryman is frequently expected to neglect his family and slowly drink himself to death after work with colleagues. Other than in his capacity to work, he is helpless, unable even to make meals for himself because of his degree of dependence on a good housewife. Lash. Yeah. Likewise, being a good housewife, or historically a good wife, wise mother, ryosai kenbo, does not necessarily mean being a satisfied person. And the pairing of a successful salaryman with a good wife can produce loneliness and frustration. A whopping 31.8% of divorces in Japan are among couples who have been married for more than 15 years, often because there's no reason to stay together once their children have grown up, and spending time together after retirement is a burden rather than a pleasure. Historically speaking, all of this is arguably a continuation of the successful hailing of the population to make gendered sacrifices to wage total warfare, which resulted in mass death and mass murder, much of which was also lonely, in the sense of bodies becoming anonymous, abandoned, and rotten. Perhaps it should come as no surprise that people would no longer like to subject themselves to such gendered sacrifice, which places such strain on people as to make them feel unfulfilled or even relationless within their relations. From this perspective, then, the ostensible failure of the heteronormative reproduction of labor power stems from its successes. Unlike in popular accounts, the low birth rate, marriage rate, and depopulation of Japan seem to arise in an attempt to avoid relationless relations. Indeed, some feminists, and I'm thinking of, for example, Chizuko Ueno, right, but also Kameoka Makoto, writing about Japan, have celebrated the so-called breakup of social bonds. They've pointed out how the dominant discourse of the relationless society obscures the relations that already exist outside of heteronormative capitalist reproduction. As Anne Allison has written, this extends beyond life into death, where some women have come together to create new continuities, such as groups of brave friends, hakatomo, who get interred together for what is imagined as eternity, separate from their husbands or patriarchal lines and households. For them, the relationless society becomes the condition of possibility for meaningful relations. There is much in this appropriation of relationlessness that is suggestive for its use as a political concept. What I find most provocative is not the ostensible novelty of the relations that arise out of it, nor is it a shift in focus from relations to relations of relations. After all, it is too easy for even a consideration of relations to leave the terms of relation in place, to ignore histories, and to obscure violence, power, and contestation. Rather, what I find provocative is the way that creative engagements with relationlessness might draw attention away from what Shunsuke Nozawa has called a fantasy of sociality, based on either kinship, which many people in Japan and elsewhere no longer find interesting, or types of relations. As a political concept, a concept that might facilitate a break in the order out of which it arises, relationlessness is less interested in identifying relations than it is in making use of the capacities of the negative without reference to that which is imagined as absent. It presupposes rather than invokes relationality. After all, as in the case of the state's use of relationlessness, often calls for a creation and or restoration, of the so-called lost object. Instead of negating the negative in such a fashion, relationlessness encourages engagement with the contours of historically specific absences and framings of those absences in order to capacitate the negative. Thank you.